The conduct of American foreign policy has entered a phase characterized by observable shifts in how the United States engages with international challenges. Analysts suggest traditional diplomatic engagement has diminished, while military signaling and economic pressure have become dominant tools. This transition raises questions about whether current approaches build sustainable frameworks or increase the probability of unintended escalation. The significance lies in understanding how policy methods shape possible outcomes and constraints facing decision-makers when crises emerge. This analysis examines structural patterns in American foreign policy through multiple dimensions: diplomatic, military, and economic tools. We will assess regional contexts where these patterns manifest, particularly regarding Iran and broader Middle East dynamics. We will evaluate implications for alliance relationships and global perceptions of American reliability. Finally, we consider scenarios for how these patterns could develop, influencing trajectories towards stability or increased confrontation. The evolution of American diplomatic practice shows measurable changes in resource allocation and institutional emphasis. The State Department budget as a percentage of total federal spending has declined, while defense spending has increased. Senior diplomatic positions have experienced higher vacancy rates and longer delays in appointments, compared to historical patterns. Career diplomatic expertise in specific regions has diminished as experienced officers retire without full replacement. These are observable facts, indicating structural changes in how diplomatic capacity is maintained and deployed. The practical consequences appear in how the United States manages disputes with adversaries and coordinates with allies. Diplomatic engagement with adversaries has become more episodic and transactional rather than sustained and relationship-based. High-level contacts occur primarily during crisis situations, not as ongoing channels for managing differences before they escalate. This contrasts with Cold War practices where sustained diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union occurred even during intense competition. Military positioning has become increasingly central to how the United States communicates policy positions. Carrier strike group deployments, bomber flights, and weapons transfers serve as primary signals of American intentions. Military moves typically precede diplomatic proposals, rather than following political agreements that military presence then guarantees. This reversal of traditional sequencing suggests that military signaling functions as the strategy itself, not supporting broader strategic frameworks. The Iran case illustrates these patterns with particular clarity. Since the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, the approach has centered on maximum pressure through sanctions, periodic military deployments, and public discussion of military options. These measures aim to compel Iranian policy changes through pressure rather than through negotiated exchanges. The logic assumes sufficient pressure will force capitulation, but observable Iranian responses suggest the opposite. Iran has expanded nuclear enrichment, deepened relationships with Russia and China, and maintained support for regional partners. The structural risk involves dynamics where neither side has diplomatic mechanisms to avoid escalation when incidents occur. Military forces from adversarial nations operating in proximity create opportunities for miscalculation. Without diplomatic channels to de-escalate, minor confrontations can spiral into larger conflicts that neither party initially sought. Historical examples, including World War I, demonstrate how great power conflicts can emerge from such dynamics. Current positioning in the Persian Gulf includes substantial American naval and air assets, creating capability for strikes. These deployments serve deterrence functions but also create vulnerabilities to miscalculation. If Iranian actions are interpreted as preparation for attack, American forces face pressure to preempt. If American military movements are interpreted by Iran as preparation for imminent strike, Iranian forces face similar pressure. Without robust diplomatic channels, the probability of miscalculation increases. The absence of diplomatic alternatives becomes critical in crisis situations. When pressure strategies are the only tool employed, adversaries face binary choices: capitulate or resist. Most governments cannot accept terms that appear as capitulation to foreign pressure, especially when domestic legitimacy depends on nationalist credentials. This creates situations where adversaries resist even when costs are high, because accepting pressure-driven terms would undermine domestic political stability. The result is confrontation neither side can easily de-escalate because both view backing down as more costly than continuation. Alliance relationships have experienced stress as American policy methods create costs for partners. European allies face economic consequences from sanctions policies they did not fully endorse but are pressed to implement. Asian allies face pressure to choose between economic relationships with China and security relationships with the United States. Middle Eastern partners navigate contradictory signals about American commitment levels and policy priorities. These stresses do not immediately break alliances but accumulate into reduced willingness to provide unreserved support. Observable evidence includes European efforts to maintain economic engagement with Iran, despite American pressure. Asian nations hedging through simultaneous engagement with both the United States and China. Middle Eastern states pursuing independent initiatives rather than waiting for American leadership. These behaviors indicate recognition that automatic alignment with American positions may impose costs exceeding benefits. This calculation has historically been unusual among close American allies, suggesting erosion of the presumption that American leadership automatically serves allied interests. The credibility dimension extends beyond specific policy disputes to questions about American consistency and reliability. When the United States withdraws from international agreements like the JCPOA, allies question whether future agreements will remain durable. When the United States articulates principles like rules-based international order but applies those principles selectively, other nations conclude that American advocacy reflects power interests rather than principled commitments. This selective application creates skepticism that accumulates into resistance when American requests require sacrifices from partners. The sanctions dimension illustrates both the reach and the limits of American economic power. The United States can impose significant costs through denial of access to dollar-denominated financial systems, American markets, and technology. These tools have proven effective at creating economic pressure on targeted nations. However, sanctions also create adaptation mechanisms that reduce effectiveness over time. Targeted nations develop alternative trading relationships, financial mechanisms, and technology sources. These adaptations do not fully offset sanctions costs, but do reduce marginal effectiveness of additional sanctions. More significantly, comprehensive sanctions against major economies create incentives for building parallel financial and trading systems that operate outside American oversight. The development of alternative payment systems, regional trading arrangements, and non-dollar transactions reduces the structural advantage the U.S. has enjoyed from dollar centrality. This process occurs gradually, but represents long-term erosion of mechanisms through which American economic power translates into political influence. The BRICS expansion and alternative institutions illustrate this dynamic. They create options for countries seeking to reduce vulnerability to American economic pressure. As these alternatives mature, the cost of aligning against American preferences decreases. This reduces the premium nations place on good relations with the U.S. The strategic question: does American policy create conditions for its own effectiveness? If sanctions succeed at acceptable cost, they validate the strategy. If they instead drive adaptation that reduces American structural advantages while failing to achieve policy objectives, they become self-defeating. Evidence after years of maximum pressure against Iran, Russia, and other targets suggests outcomes closer to the latter than the former. These nations have not capitulated, developed workarounds for sanctions, and deepened relationships, creating alternative poles in the international system. The military dimension reflects similar patterns. American military superiority remains significant, providing capability to prevail in direct conflicts. However, this capability has not translated into ability to impose desired political outcomes at acceptable cost. Recent conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria demonstrate that military victory in specific battles does not necessarily produce stable political settlements. Adversaries have developed strategies including irregular warfare, proxy relationships, and attrition that avoid direct confrontation while imposing costs. The result is growing recognition among adversaries that American military power, while formidable, faces constraints that create opportunities for resistance. Understanding of these constraints informs adversary strategies that avoid triggering overwhelming American response while still advancing adversary interests. This dynamic does not eliminate American military advantage but does reduce its utility as a tool for achieving political objectives. Domestic political dynamics affect foreign policy formulation in ways that create strategic complications. When foreign policy becomes subject to intense partisan competition, consistency becomes difficult. Policies adopted by one administration face reversal by successors, creating uncertainty among both allies and adversaries about whether commitments will be honored. This uncertainty reduces willingness to make concessions based on American promises because the durability of those promises is questioned. Additionally, foreign policy increasingly serves domestic political signaling functions. Actions are taken not primarily because they advance specific international objectives, but because they demonstrate toughness or commitment to particular domestic constituencies. This creates situations where policy serves domestic political needs, while creating international complications. When domestic political benefit drives decisions, the international strategic logic becomes secondary, producing policies that may be domestically popular but strategically counterproductive. Media dynamics amplify these patterns. Dramatic actions receive more coverage than patient diplomatic processes, creating incentives for policymakers to choose visible displays of strength over quiet negotiations. Crisis framing generates pressure for decisive action, even when measured responses would better serve strategic interests. The result is policy that responds to media cycle demands rather than strategic logic, with decisions driven by imperative to demonstrate action, rather than by careful cost-benefit analysis. The absence of coherent grand strategy creates another structural problem. Without clear articulation of priorities and resource allocation among competing objectives, policy becomes reactive and contradictory. The United States simultaneously pursues major power competition with China and Russia, manages instability across the Middle East, maintains alliance commitments in Europe and Asia, and addresses transnational challenges including terrorism and proliferation. Each of these objectives demands substantial resources and attention. Without prioritization, resources spread across all missions create vulnerability in each. Strategic clarity would require acknowledging that not all objectives can be pursued simultaneously. At maximum effort, that trade-offs exist between competing goals, and that choices must be made about which interests are vital versus important versus peripheral. The absence of such clarity creates expectation that the United States will respond to all challenges everywhere, setting conditions for eventual overextension. When commitments exceed capacity to sustain them, the Middle East presents particular concentration of these dynamics. The United States maintains substantial military presence, security commitments to multiple partners with contradictory interests, and complex relationships regarding energy security, terrorism threats, and regional stability, simultaneously managing relationships with Israel, Gulf Arab states, Turkey, Egypt, and other regional actors, while also confronting Iran creates contradictory commitments that limit policy flexibility. When actions supporting one partner undermine relationships with others, the cumulative effect reduces American influence with all parties. The risk of major war in the region combines multiple factors. Iranian nuclear program advancement creates pressure for preventive action before capability is fully developed. Israeli threat perceptions and domestic politics create additional pressure for action against Iranian nuclear sites and regional positions. American security commitments to Israel could draw the United States into conflicts initiated by others. Regional rivalries between Iran and Gulf Arab states create multiple flashpoints where local conflicts could escalate. The density of American military assets in the region means that any regional conflict likely involves American forces, either deliberately or through proximity. War initiation could occur through multiple pathways. Israeli strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities could trigger Iranian retaliation against American forces in the region, creating pressure for American escalation. Iranian actions against Gulf shipping or infrastructure could trigger American military response that expands into broader conflict. Proxy conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, or Lebanon could escalate into direct confrontation between principals. Terrorist attacks attributed to Iranian proxies could generate demands for punitive response. Each pathway involves initial actions by multiple parties, but escalation dynamics could produce conflict exceeding what any party initially intended. The absence of diplomatic off-ramps makes escalation control difficult once military action begins. If strikes occur without parallel diplomatic channels, through which terms for cessation can be negotiated, the conflict continues until one side achieves military victory or exhaustion forces cessation. Neither outcome is assured to be rapid or contained. Iranian capabilities for imposing costs through asymmetric means including missile attacks, proxy forces, and economic disruption could sustain conflict over extended period. American capability for strikes against Iranian assets is substantial, but does not guarantee rapid political capitulation. Three scenarios emerge from analysis of current trajectories in American foreign policy. The first involves course correction, where recognition of risks leads to restoration of diplomatic engagement. This requires leadership prioritizing strategic effectiveness, rebuilding diplomatic capacity, and allied cooperation. Early indicators include high-level diplomatic engagement with adversaries to establish crisis communication channels. Implications include reduced probability of unintended escalation and improved allied cooperation. This scenario aims to contain disagreements within manageable bounds, not eliminate them entirely. The challenge is whether domestic politics allow for patient strategy over dramatic gestures. The second scenario involves continued drift, where current patterns persist without major correction. This represents a continuation of observable trends without dramatic change in either direction. Conditions include domestic political constraints, bureaucratic inertia, and absence of severe crisis. Indicators include sanctions-focused approaches, military signaling, and incremental allied distancing. Implications include erosion of American advantages, increasing miscalculation, and eventual unsustainability. Change comes reactively after problems manifest, rather than proactively through recognition. History shows great powers often recognize strategic problems only after costs become severe. The third scenario involves escalation into military conflict through structural conditions. This doesn't require a deliberate choice for war, but emerges from crisis escalating beyond control. Conditions include military incidents in high-tension regions and absence of diplomatic mechanisms. Early indicators would be military confrontations, rapid escalation, and pressure for preemption. Implications include military conflict with costs exceeding expectations and economic disruption. This scenario represents the risk that policy structure creates conditions where war becomes possible. The analytical framework suggests how policy is conducted matters as much as specific positions. When diplomatic capacity erodes and military tools substitute for comprehensive strategy, vulnerability increases. This occurs not through single dramatic failures but accumulation of small decisions. Foreign policy effectiveness depends on maintaining multiple capabilities simultaneously. Military strength deters aggression, diplomatic skill manages disputes, economic relationships create mutual interests, alliance networks share burdens and provide legitimacy. When policy emphasizes only military strength, overall effectiveness degrades. The challenge is whether this pattern will be recognized while correction remains feasible. Contemporary American foreign policy exhibits reduced diplomatic engagement and increased reliance on pressure. These patterns suggest structural rather than merely political drivers. The analysis identifies how these patterns create increased probability of unintended escalation. Three scenarios remain plausible: course correction, continued drift, or escalation into military conflict. What remains uncertain is whether structural problems will be addressed proactively, or whether recognition will come only through experience of the costs that current patterns create. The fundamental question is whether policy structure creates conditions making conflicts more probable than necessary.